Hello, and welcome to the 2020 Election Judge Training. My name is Julie Hanson. I'm the Property and Customer Service Manager for Scott County, and one of those areas includes elections. On our agenda for today is to talk about preparing for Election Day, opening duties, Election Day stations and tasks such as greeter station, registration station, which we would call our poll book station, the demonstration station, ballot station, and ballot counter station. Keep in mind that your head judge or clerk may set up your polling place differently than these stations indicate, and that's okay. We'll also talk about polling place conduct and closing. Let's talk about preparing for Election Day. You have the right to take time off of work to serve as an election judge. In order to do so, you should notify your employer at least 20 days before Election Day, and if you would have earned more working at your day job than as an election judge, your employer will pay the difference. For example, if you're making $10 an hour as an election judge, and at work you would make $15 an hour, your employer will still pay you the difference of $5 an hour for hours you would have worked. Your election office will provide you with the appropriate notification letter for your employer on their letterhead. Election Day is a long day, so please be mindful about taking care of yourself. Have a plan for food. Is your polling place around restaurants? Are they open for lunch? Do you need to bring your own breakfast, lunch, or dinner, or does your clerk provide that? Are you located in a breezy gymnasium and should wear layers? I don't think that's going to be a problem for August, but there's no formal dress code for election judges. We only ask that you wear nothing political, as polling places are a politically neutral space. You may work in a precinct outside of your own, which means you may have to vote absentee before Election Day. If you do work in the polling place for the precinct in which you live, by all means, vote on Election Day. We just ask that you move to the other side of the check-in table and go through the voting process like any voter would. Plan ahead for your day to care for pets or loved ones if you need a ride home after that really long day, anything like that. And like we said, most importantly, don't forget to vote. Let's take a look at the opening duties. At the beginning of your shift, you will affirm the election judge oath, which will be administered by your head election judge. What is the Election Judge Code of Conduct? What does this oath look like in practice? Keep in mind that voters remember their Election Day voting experiences. Voting isn't just another monotonous interaction with the government. Voting can be very high stakes and exciting. Voters remember their check-in process, how long they waited in line, if they had more obstacles or perceived obstacles to voting than the person in line before them, etc. We want to make sure every voter's Election Day experience is a smooth and efficient one, just as we would want for ourselves. We ask you to be impartial, courteous, and professional, to maintain your polling place's accessibility, neutrality, and efficiency, and to enjoy assisting and serving diverse populations. Just like to take a moment to think about if you've ever had a difficult voting experience. What was it that made it difficult? If you haven't had a difficult voting experience, that's great. That's what we're shooting for. But think about maybe what was your experience at a local government office, or what was your experience even in line waiting at a store like Target or Walmart. Was there something that made it difficult? Let's do our best to try and make things as smooth as possible for everyone and make voting an enjoyable experience. Let's take a look at polling place judge roles. Every polling place has a head judge, could have an assistant head judge, and they are seasoned judges with additional training. Their number one job is to support their team. Your head and assistant head judges are a resource for you to use throughout Election Day. The greeter judge stands near the entrance to welcome voters and manage the lines. They have the tools necessary to check and see if a voter is pre-registered, though with poll pads, that's a pretty easy process and a quick process for us to do. The roster and registration judge roles with poll pads have generally been combined, but we do have a demonstration judge. Oftentimes that's combined with the ballot judge and the ballot counter judge. You could also have student judges. This diagram just shows us a typical polling place layout. On election day, keep in mind the location of power outlets, accessibility, where are the directional signs placed. It does look different with poll books. That roster and registration table are more likely combined. Remember that you do need to set up your modem somewhere, hopefully near a window and not close to the door. We don't want someone walking off with that. Are there chairs available for voters waiting in line? Do you have appropriate voting booths set up? Remember that voting booths, chairs, anything that a voter touches is going to need to be disinfected. Keep in mind that each polling place is different, but here are some questions to ask yourself during setup in the morning to make sure that your polling place is accessible as it can be. For access, are all parts of the polling place accessible for voters? Can a voter using a wheelchair easily move from station to station? For traffic flow, where will lines of voters likely bottleneck? Is it clear which station a voter should move to next? And of course, privacy. Arrange the voting stations with privacy in mind, including the assistive voting devices, as well as keeping in mind our social distancing needs. Don't forget to have a stable, flat surface for completing forms, should they be needed, chairs for voters waiting in line, and make sure you set up at least one voting booth that is wheelchair accessible and includes a chair. There are some additional setup tasks. Designate and clearly mark disability parking spaces if they're not already done. Mark the route to an accessible entrance. Mark the accessible route to the voting room itself. Post informational posters. Post the flag at the entrance. And please ensure social distancing. As far as the posting of informational posters, there are many signs that need to be posted in the polling place, both informative and directional. So during morning setup, the head judge will assign at least one judge to put up their signs and posters in the polling place room, the building, and outside. Treat all signs as if they're required to be posted because most of them are. Head judges, please give your polling place a walkthrough before opening to make sure that accessible parking spaces, routes, and directional signs are properly posted. An assisted voting device or ballot marking machine allows for a voter to mark their ballot with the paddles and headphones, so the machine can read the ballot to the voter and tell them which choices they are making as they vote. We want to afford voters using the assistive ballot marking device the same access and right to privacy as a voter completing their ballot in a voting booth. Keep in mind our ballot marking device is integrated with our tabulator. It needs to be accessible for a voter using a wheelchair, and the external screen should be turned towards them and not towards the main flow of traffic through the polling place. Please test when you're setting up your tabulator that the audio is working. It has to read a blank ballot correctly, and make sure the buttons function. We have tested this before we have sent this out to your polling place, but if you don't know how to use this machine, and if you reside in the polling place you're working in, this is a great opportunity for you to utilize and be able to assist voters with it should they need help. The ballot counter. The head or assistant head judge will lead the tabulator setup. They will verify that the ballot box is empty and that 0 votes have been counted on the machine. They will lock or seal the ballot box and record the seal number on their paperwork. The ballot counter itself counts and secures the voter's ballots. It will let the voter and the ballot tabulator judge know if a vote was counted without issue. At the end you get a beep, or if there was some kind of error in reading the ballot. A typical error message may read that the voter voted for too many candidates, that the ballot is blank, or that they cross-party voted in this primary election. Your head election judge will advise you on how many packets of ballots to open in the morning. The ballot tracking form is used to record how many ballots are prepared at the end of the day, to verify that you received the correct amount of ballots in the morning, and to record how many blank ballots you've left at the end of the day. Why wouldn't you want to just open all the packets and get ballot prep out of the way? Because at the end of the night, you need to provide the total number of blank ballots in your precinct. So if you leave ballots in their shrink-wrapped packs, they can be easily counted to see how many you have left instead of having to count individual blank ballots. Make sure that when you open an initial supply of ballot, you count them to verify that there's the right amount in the shrink-wrapped pack and that 2 judges initial each ballot. Before diving into the duties and processes that take place at each station, I want you to be aware of a couple of things which come into play often: the incident log and party balance activities. We will be referring to both throughout the training, so allow me to clarify what they are now. The incident log is typically maintained by head judges. It lets officials know, such as myself, what occurred in the precinct. You record how problems were resolved, and it's returned back to us in the red folder with the precinct supplies. Talking about party balance, it's to ensure fairness so that 2 judges of differing major political parties have to do certain tasks together, such as taking ballots out of the ballot box or doing curbside voting. Now let's talk about some election day stations and the different tasks associated with each. The greeter station. The greeter judge can make or break a voter's experience. You are the first person voters interact with. We want you to be prepared to welcome voters, answer questions, verify voters in the right place, that they have what they need to register on election day. You're going to be in charge of line management and probably social distancing. You're also able to check if a voter is pre-registered, as you'll have the greeters list. Next, let's talk about the registration station, or as we would call it, the poll book station. Minnesota consistently has some of the highest voter turnout in the country. A large part of this is due to the fact that we have Election Day registration. Voters who want to register on Election Day must provide proof of residence in order to prove that they are eligible to vote in this precinct. There are several ways to provide proof of residence, some of which involve a voter showing us their photo ID, but many do not, and we'll go over some of those examples shortly. To register and vote on Election Day, you have to, of course, be eligible to vote. You have to register and vote within your own precinct and provide proof of residence. What are the voter eligibility requirements anyway? Well, someone needs to be a U.S. citizen. They need to be at least 18 years old on Election Day. They have to have been a resident of Minnesota for 20 days, not necessarily in your precinct, but just within the state of Minnesota. They need to be finished with all parts of any felony sentence. A person can vote if they're under guardianship unless a judge specifically has revoked their right to vote. A person cannot vote if a court has ruled that they are legally incompetent. There are 7 possible ways for a voter to provide proof of residence. Some of those ways involve a voter showing us an ID, others do not. We always ask voters for proof of residence. We do not ask if we can see their ID. You can tell them that in order to expedite their experience, you can scan their driver's license into the poll pad. That's okay, but please don't ask to see their identification or tell them it's not required. Voter ID requirements are a hot button political issue, and in Minnesota, registered voters don't need to show an ID. Voters who need to register may end up showing us an ID as a form of proof of residence, but a lot of people won't have to do that. We always do ask, like I said, to see proof of residence instead of ID. Option 1, an ID with current name and address. So that could be a current Minnesota driver's license, an instruction permit, or an ID card, or a receipt for any of these. Keep in mind that Minnesota's system now does issue a photo on their receipt. It could also be a tribal ID if it contains a name, a current address, a signature, and a picture. So what does current mean? It means that the ID is not expired, that it has their current name and their current address, which was within your precinct. If they're showing a receipt for an ID, you're not required to show an additional photo ID. The receipt alone is sufficient. A voter showing a tribal ID is not required to live on a reservation for it to serve as a valid proof of residence. Option 2, a photo ID and a document with the current name and address. So a voter could also show you this photo ID and a document with their current name and address. An ID could be one of the following options: a driver's license, a state ID, or an instruction permit issued by any state, a United States passport, a United States military or veteran ID, a tribal ID with name, signature, and photo, a Minnesota University College or Technical College ID, or a Minnesota High School ID. The document with the address has to be one of the following: a bill, an account, or start of service statement for their phone, TV, or internet, solid waste, sewer, electric, gas, or water, banking or a credit card statement, rent or mortgage statement, a current lease or rent agreement valid through Election Day, or a current student fee statement. If they use option 2, a couple of questions. Can this bill or document be dated just any date? No, it has to be due or dated within 30 days of Election Day. Can a voter show you this document on their phone? Yes, absolutely they can. Can the ID be expired or have an old address listed? Yes, it can. Option 3 is vouching. If you don't have a document to serve as proof of residence, you can just bring a person. A voucher must know the voter personally. Vouchers have to live in the same precinct and either be pre-registered to vote or register on Election Day. A person who is vouched for on Election Day cannot then vouch for someone else. Do you remember how many voters a voucher can vouch for? That's a tongue twister. They can vouch for 8 voters. You will track this in your poll pad as their voter ID needs to be included when the vouched for person is registering. Number 4 is residential facility vouching. If a voter lives in a residential facility, a staff person of that facility can vouch for them. For our purposes, a residential facility would be defined as a place such as a nursing home, a homeless shelter, a battered women's shelter, or assisted living. The staff person would have to provide proof of employment, which could be an employee badge or a letter of employment on the company letterhead. So how many voters can the residential facility voucher vouch for? They can vouch for as many as live in that facility and come in to vote. In this case, does the residential facility voucher need to be eligible to vote in that precinct? No, they don't. The fifth option would be a notice of late registration. So there's a pre-registration cutoff 20 days before the election. That gives us time to update and upload voter files that then we can download to create the electronic rosters. If a voter were to register within the 20-day window, we would attempt to process their application and send them this notice of late registration letter. If they receive it in time, they can bring it in and it will serve as their proof of residence. They will have to register again in your poll pad, but this document will serve as their necessary proof of residence. Option number 6 is valid registration in the same precinct. So if a voter was pre-registered in your precinct, but they've changed their name, or they've moved, but they still live within the same precinct, the voter's previous registration can serve as their proof of residence. So it seems odd, but think of it this way. If a voter has a pre-existing registration in that same precinct, it means that their existing voter record has been recently checked and validated by us. If a voter has switched apartments, moved across the street, or changed their name for any reason, this is all information that can be verified by us just the same as any other proof of residence provided. Option number 7, the last option that we'll talk about today, is a student ID with a college list. Now, this isn't something that we're going to see here in Scott County, but just so you know it's out there, the precinct could be provided with a list of students that are housed at a Minnesota college or university, and then the students on the list could register by showing current valid student. Now let's talk about the demonstration station. So a demonstration judge helps the voter to understand how to mark their ballot without making any ballot marking mistakes. Some common examples of mistakes are, especially in the August primary, crossing party lines. Another example is voting for too many candidates in a single race, making accidental marks outside of the bubbles, which could trip up the tabulator, or not completely filling in the voting circles. When giving instructions on how to mark a ballot, create a speech that works for you. Here are the things that should be included. Please make all voters aware that they can use the assistive voting device, the voting booths, or a table to mark their ballot. We always want to offer the assisted voting marking machine to everyone because we can't make any assumptions about who would benefit from using it and who wouldn't. We would tell them if they've made a mistake to go ahead and bring their ballot back and get a replacement. You may remember in the presidential nomination primary that we directed voters that once they leave the ballot table, they couldn't get a replacement. That's no longer the case. We're back to the old rules. Be sure to point out the tabulator or the ballot counter. If there's two sides of the ballot, which there are, make the voter aware of that. Again, make them aware that they cannot choose more than one party, that the August primary is only to vote within one party lines. When you're explaining to a voter how to properly mark their ballot, like when they need to fill in the oval next to the candidate that they wish to vote for, please make sure that you're not only pointing at one candidate or political party. It's kind of best to gesture at the ballot with an open hand as you explain partisan primary divides or other details. We, of course, want to remain neutral in the polling place. Here's some instructions for the August primary elections. There are no space for write-in votes, and on partisan races, please direct voters to only vote for candidates from one political party. If they cross over from different political parties, the votes will not count. Should we have ballot questions on our ballot, and in November we probably will, please do not interpret what a ballot question means or try to explain what the impact would be if it passed or failed. Again, this is being partisan. We don't want to direct anyone in any certain Now let's talk about the ballot station. For most polling places that I've seen, usually the ballot station and the demonstration judge duties are combined, but each precinct does do it a little bit differently. This is where voters receive their ballot. What is the thing that we need to receive from them before handing them a ballot? Yes, the voter receipt. We need to receive a voter receipt from each voter before handing them their ballot. Those are the receipts that are generated off of the poll pad. If they don't have a voter receipt, they haven't checked in at the registration station. If all goes well, and we cross our fingers that it will, the amount of ballot receipts matches the amount of check-ins on the poll pad, which matches the amount of voters in the tabulator. The ballot judge is responsible for counting and tracking the packs of ballots, for collecting the voter receipts, and issuing the ballot. In August, school district splits are not an issue, but when we get to the November election, we will be back to having multiple ballots for each precinct. So just be very careful. The ballot receipt that you receive from the voter does give the style of ballot that they should receive. So just take a good look at that when they give it in to you. This talks about what to do with spoiled and found ballots. So if a voter makes a ballot marking mistake, they can bring their ballot back to receive a new one. Their original ballot goes in the spoiled ballot envelope. Also, voters can sometimes leave the polling place without casting their ballots. They may leave it on the floor, in a voting booth, take it to the restroom with them. Found ballots would also go in the spoiled ballot envelope. You would mark found in blank wherever it was found on the ballot, and these should be marked on the incident log. If you were to find a ballot that's already marked and already filled out, would you put it in the tabulator? No, you wouldn't. We don't really know if they gave up and they intended to not vote, if something happened and they just left. But to ensure the integrity and security of the election, it would go in the spoiled ballot envelope with the rest. Now we're going to talk about the ballot counter station, or as we usually call it, the tabulator judge. So the tabulator judge, we ensure that the voters' ballots are being properly counted by the tabulator, and of course, issue the very important and very popular I voted stickers. As we've already referred to, the tabulator judge will monitor operation of the ballot counter, while of course always maintaining a 6-foot distance from the tabulator. They'll distribute the I voted stickers. Please don't place them on the voters yourself. If the tabulator indicates that the ballot box needs to be emptied, alert the head judge. The head judge will have 2 judges of different political parties come over to open the ballot box and take those ballots out. For the November election, if there are write-ins, if you're removing ballots from the tabulator, please keep those ballots with write-ins from a separate container. Record the time, initial of judges, and any seal numbers. They would be used to secure ballots on the incident log. Generally, like we said, only the voter should be within 6 feet of the tabulator unless they need assistance. If you need any assistance at all with If there's a ballot marking error, the tabulator will beep and return the ballot. The voter can choose to spoil their ballot and get a new one, or they can cast it as is. So if the voter sees an error pop up on the screen, let them know there was an error. If you're going to discuss the error in general, such as simply explaining the logistics of the fact that maybe they crossed parties or they overvoted, that's fine. But if the voter is asking you to examine their ballot and explain further, please be sure to do this with a second judge who can provide party balance. Remember, as we've already talked about, if a voter crosses party in a partisan primary, which is this August election, none of their votes in the partisan part of the ballot will be counted. Please make sure to take extra time to explain the consequences of casting a ballot if they make this error, because we do want everyone's vote to count. All right, let's review some guidelines for fairness and order in the polling place. So who is allowed in the polling place? Largely, only election judges, voters, and voter assistants should be in the polling place. But some other common authorized visitors are challengers, the media, and observers with written authorization. If someone wishes to enter the polling place, please alert your head judge. Appointed challengers. While challengers are most often appointed by political parties or partisan groups, an election judge or any eligible voter in the precinct could also contest a voter's eligibility. A challenger must have personal knowledge that a voter is not eligible. Suspicion is not a basis for making a challenge. Challengers cannot speak to voters and election judges, inspect or handle any election materials, make a list of who has voted. They can't be disruptive or take photos in the polling place, and they can't go within 6 feet of the tabulator or influence voters. If there's an appointed challenger in your precinct, your head judge will speak with them and get them seated in a space where they can observe the check-in tables. If for some reason you have an issue, please alert your head judge and they will either speak with the clerk or give us a call. So as we know, there's a prohibition on campaigning within 100 feet of the polling place. However, if the polling place is on public property, campaigning is not allowed anywhere on the property, even beyond 100 feet. This rule does not apply to adjacent private property. So for example, a lot of our polling places are in schools. If there are homes right next to or right across the street from the school and people have campaigning signs in their yard, that is not against the rules. That is quite all right. However, if you have someone park in the parking lot and they have a campaigning magnet on the side of their truck or signs in their vehicle, that isn't allowed. So as we know, part of the prohibition on campaigning is stating that voters can't wear or display campaign materials. So maybe a button or a hat or a shirt. If it's on the ballot, they can wear or display political material that's not on the ballot. So if they want to wear a shirt that says, I support gun rights, or they want to wear a shirt that says, I support Governor Walz, that's okay because those things are not on our ballot this year. If they have something on that specifically supports a candidate that's on the ballot, we need to ask the voter to either cover up or remove the campaign material while in the polling place. However, if they refuse, they need to be allowed to vote, but you would record their name and note the event in the incident log. Remember, election judges may not wear or discuss anything Voters can get help from election judges or any person of their choice, except from an agent of their employer, union, or candidate. In the past, voter assistants were only allowed to help a maximum of 3 voters to physically mark their ballot, but due to a recent Minnesota District Court decision, this is no longer the case. Voter assistants can assist as many voters in marking their ballot as needed. Remember that election judges can assist voters, but please help only as much as requested. 2 election judges of different major political parties can mark or observe a ballot according to the voter's direction. If an election judge is providing language assistance or needs some language assistance, please remember that there are language interpretation hotlines available on election day. That information is available in the middle of your red folder. If you have someone providing assistance for your voter, please make sure you direct questions to the voter, not the translator who happens to be with them. So with curbside voting, voters can vote from their vehicle. You would not bring the actual roster outside, which in our case would be poll pads. You would bring the voter a certificate of registered voter form. These are located in your red folders. With COVID-19, there could definitely be an influx of curbside voters as people are trying to practice social distancing. In preparation for this, please review the curbside voting procedures in your election judge handbook. Remember, this is a party balance activity, so this needs to be done with 2 judges of differing political parties. If you do participate in curbside voting for a voter, we would ask you to please wear a mask when you go outside, to sanitize your hands as soon as you come back in, and to wipe down any pens or materials that the voter may have touched when you get back into the building. As we've already talked about, we want every voter to have a smooth and positive voting experience. The best way to do that is to offer all voters the same options for navigating the polling place and voting procedures, such as accessible voting booths or the assistive ballot marking device. If you have voters who are blind or have low vision, please first ask them if they would like assistance. Then you can offer your arm for them to hold and paint a verbal picture of the pathway. If you have to leave, please inform the voter when you're leaving or if another judge will be taking over. Have a magnifying glass at the roster table for voters with partial vision. Thankfully, with poll pads, things are a little bit larger than they are in a paper roster. If you have voters who are deaf or hard of hearing, please speak calmly and directly to the voter. Please avoid the impulse to talk louder to someone with a hearing impairment. Pointing to appropriate objects or using visual aids can be helpful, and sometimes written communication just works the best. All right, so let's talk about closing the polls. So as we know, the polls close at 8 o'clock. So anyone in line at 8 p.m. can and should be allowed to vote. Once the last voter has left, you can then begin the takedown of signs and equipment. Your head judge will lead the closing duties. Please work with them to make sure required documents are properly completed. The polling place needs to remain open to the public until all voting is finished, and members of the public observing the closing do not have to provide a letter like challengers would. All right, for some of you, this is just about the end. For some of you, we're going to ask you to do a little bit more. But everyone, after you've completed this PowerPoint, we are going to ask you to also complete the 2020 Election Judge Guide, complete the Election Judge Workbook, and view the training videos that were linked in the instructions. Once you're done, please notify your clerk, whether it be a city or township clerk, when you have completed your training, and they then in turn will notify me. We would ask you to please have this done by the end of July. Head judges, I'm going to ask you to please tune in for a little bit more. We are going to go into some more detailed procedures. All other election judges, you're all finished with this show today. We so appreciate all of you being willing to be an election judge. We literally could not do this without you. Thank you for sticking through this electronic version of the training rather than in person. I'm missing all of your faces, and I can't wait to see you after all of this is back to normal, or at least we find our new normal. Thank you. All right, head judges, we're going to talk about some more details and some procedures. If you're an election judge, not a head judge, and you chose to stay tuned, of course, that is just fine. I'm happy to have you. Head judge duties. Head judge is the lead official in the polling place. They may pick up precinct supplies before the election, or that could be something that the local clerk would do. They oversee the polling place setup and takedown. They administer the election judge oath, conduct the challenge process, and complete the elections returns and other forms. You, of course, are answering questions, solving problems for your team, for voters. You're responsible for ensuring the integrity and ease of the election process that's taking place in your polling place. As part of head judge training, we're going to go over in detail some of the subjects that we have talked about in election judge training, but as heads and assistants, you're the one that would be handling high-level situations and processes. Some other duties would include understanding your election emergency plan, conducting emergency judge training for replacement judges, understanding rules about media in the polling place, closing the polling place, and resolving questions and problems. We ask you to please make a concerted effort of being aware of who is in your polling place and their conduct. Authorized persons that can be in the polling place could be persons helping a voter, kids accompanying voters, vouchers, observers that have written authorization from the Secretary of State, from our office, or the local clerk, peace officers if an election judge requests their presence, challengers that are appointed in writing by a political party or nonpartisan candidate, teachers and elementary or high school students if they're participating in a mock election that's been authorized, persons making a written complaint, media, or people conducting exit polls. They can be on the premises, but they can't be in the room where voting occurs. A member of the media must present their photo ID to the head judge and either a media credential or a written statement from a local election official. They cannot approach within 6 feet of someone voting. They can't converse with a voter in the polling place. They cannot make a list of persons voting or not voting, and they cannot interfere with the voting process. Let's talk about the challenge procedure. So a challenged voter would have to swear the oath. The election judge would question the voter regarding the challenge. Now remember that in the poll pad, each challenged voter has the questions come up that they need to be asked when you select the challenged voter. If the voter's answer indicate that they're eligible, they would be allowed to sign the roster or the voter receipt and vote. If they refuse to answer questions or sign the roster, they cannot vote. They cannot come back later in the day and vote. You would want to mark that on your election judge incident log that the voter refused to answer or sign the voter receipt and that they left. Let's talk about some common roster notations. If you see an AB in your poll pad next to a voter name in a line, that means that the voter has already cast an absentee ballot and they cannot vote again in person. If your voter insists that they did not vote absentee, please give us a call. We can take a look and research their absentee ballot application and figure out what could have happened. If you see a CID on your poll pad, someone must show proof of residence document. And there's multiple challenges. There could be a postal return, that they voted out of precinct, it's unverifiable, felony, or guardianship. And as I said before, each situation has its own set of challenge questions. These are listed in your election judge guide, but of course they're also listed on the poll pad so that you'll have them right at your fingertips if you need them. This just talks a little bit more about the challenge procedure. Again, you'd have the voter swear or affirm the oath. They will not swear. Ask them if they will affirm. Ask the appropriate questions out of your guide, or like I said, on the poll pad, for example, with a felony, are you on probation or parole for a felony conviction? And make a note in the incident log about removing a roster challenge. That gives us the ability to go back and look at that and do any research as we need to. If your tabulator should stop working, or if it doesn't boot up in the morning like you think it should, if there's some type of problem, with party balance, please open the auxiliary slot on the ballot box and contact your clerk. Voting should continue without interruption, and then you can notify us for assistance. When the counter is working again, you can then, again with party balance, put ballots into the counter that you took out of the auxiliary slot. Again, during voting hours, it is a party balance activity to open that tabulator compartment or to Let's talk about closing the polls. We're going to talk about processing ballots and completing summary statements. One very important thing to talk about is in the red circled area. It says the number of election judges who worked in the precinct and the number of voting booths in this precinct. These summary statements are printed out on your tabulator after closing. If you have a worksheet like this in your red folder that you've been delivered, depending on your clerk, you may be asked to fill that out, and maybe your clerk will fill out the tabulator instructions. Follow whatever it is that they tell you. Otherwise, if you're following directions from us and you have a precinct summary statement that looks like a full sheet of paper, that's for practice. We're going to ask you to fill out the tape on the actual tabulator machine. If you have write-ins, which we, again, do not have for the primary election, we will for the general, you will have a separate write-in log. Everyone who wants their name counted on the ballot, of course, for county, state, and federal elections needs to register. All local election names do need to be counted. So what happens when the number of signatures on the roster or the poll pad does not equal the number of ballots in the box? Well, you need to review for excess ballots. If you have more votes than voters, that is a problem. Reach out to us right away. What we're going to ask you to do is to pull all of those ballots out of the box. With party balance, of course, you would have to pull the appropriate amount of random ballots for your excess ballots, zero out your tabulator, and rerun all of your ballots. And that needs to be done before you transmit results to the county. If you have more voters than you do have ballots, you can proceed. Someone could have taken their ballot with them or something like that. That situation is okay, but you never want to have more ballots than you have signatures on the roster. You're going to pack the supplies and any unused ballots up. You're going to seal all the used ballots, make sure your ballot box is empty, including your write-in slot, and then you're going to deliver the election materials and the results to either your clerk or to us, depending on your directions. Remember, if you're delivering your materials directly to the county, you don't deliver those until the following day. I'd like like to talk a little bit about elections and COVID-19. This has certainly thrown us for a loop this year. 2020 is going to be the year to remember. Came out of left field. So there are some important things that we need to make sure that we're thinking about, keeping very conscious in our minds regarding COVID-19. One of those things is social distancing. You need to ensure everyone is 6 feet apart whenever possible. Please have a way to mark floors. This includes voters waiting outside of the polling place. You may need to limit the number of people in the polling place as well to ensure social distancing. For sanitizing, please have hand sanitizer available for voters to use when entering and leaving the polls. Clean voting booths after each voter with an appropriate cleaning solution. Have bins for marking pens to be collected. Make sure those are sanitized before using again. And judges should sanitize frequently. Gloves are not recommended as they have a tendency to just spread germs and not be used appropriately. We would recommend you wash your hands or use hand sanitizer often. For PPE in the polling place. PPE stands for personal protective equipment. Masks are strongly encouraged in the polling place at this time. They are currently not required. We cannot require them for voters unless Governor Walz decides to mandate them. Some masks will be provided to the polling places for voters to wear. It's okay for you to ask, do you have a mask you can wear? If not, we can provide one, but you can't force them to wear one. We ask you to please keep track of how many masks are being used so that we can make adjustments for the general election. When you're sanitizing equipment, such as the poll pads and the tabulator, an alcohol solution spray should be sprayed onto a soft cloth and wiped over the poll pad or the buttons on the tabulator. Please do not spray the equipment directly. We would ask you to not over sanitize poll pads. We don't want to do any damage, of course, to these machines. They are not waterproof. They don't need to be sanitized between every voter. They would need to be sanitized between shifts of election judges. Please unplug the poll pad from the charging cord before you wipe it down and then plug it back in. The tabulator shouldn't need to be touched very much. If you have someone use the assisted voting device, you do need to spray that down. And again, please spray the cloth and gently wipe it down until it's dry. All right, everybody, thanks for sticking with me for so long. A reminder to go back and please do the Election Judge workbook to let your clerk know when you are complete. But I just can't say thank you enough for being willing to do this, especially in 2020 and this environment we're facing. As I said, we literally couldn't do this without you. We do, of course, provide contact information for the county in your red folder that you receive with your election supplies. If you need us for anything on Election Day, you know we're available. I'm here by 5 o'clock on Election Day and here until the very end. So thank you again. Again, I miss your faces. I look forward to talking with you on Election Day. And I hope this electronic training has been a good thing. Please let me know. I'm very interested in your feedback. Thank you again. Have a great day, and here's to a successful election cycle.